Al Capone, the real Scarface and the rise of organized crime. Welcome to Bytes, where we bring the stories of history's most fascinating figures to life. In this episode, we're diving into the world of Al Capone, a man whose name became synonymous with power, crime, and infamy during the Prohibition era. Let's explore how a boy from Brooklyn became one of the most notorious gangsters in American history. Al Capone's story begins on a chilly January day in 1899. When Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in the bustling borough of Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Gabriel and Teresa Capone, were Italian immigrants who had left behind the small village of Angri near Naples in search of a better future. Like so many who arrived in America at the time, they hoped to build a new life amidst the promise and chaos of the big city. Gabriel worked as a barber, trimming hair and shaving faces to provide for his growing family. Teresa, a skilled seamstress, juggled her trade while raising their 9 children. Life wasn't easy, but the Capones were resourceful and resilient. Their first home was in the Navy Yard area of downtown Brooklyn, a crowded neighborhood full of working-class families, before they moved to a more stable residence in Park Slope when Al was 11. The household was lively, to say the least. Al was one of 8 siblings, and the bustling streets of Brooklyn became his playground. It was here, surrounded by the grit and determination of immigrant life, that he first learned how to navigate a world where opportunities and dangers often went hand in hand. Brooklyn at the turn of the century was a melting pot of cultures. The streets hummed with the accents of Italian, Irish, and Jewish families trying to carve out a space for themselves in this rapidly expanding city. For a young Al Capone, the neighborhood was a school of hard knocks, a place where respect had to be earned, and survival often depended on wit and toughness. Growing up, Alphonse showed early promise as a student. His parents, like many immigrant families, valued education as a path to success. Al brought home excellent grades, and his mother, Teresa, took great pride in her son's achievements. But the strict rules of his Catholic upbringing often clashed with his fiery nature. It was clear early on that Al wasn't one to follow the rules without question. This defiant streak would come to a head when, at just 14 years old, Al was expelled from school after striking a teacher. It was a turning point in his young life. His formal education ended that day, but his real schooling was just beginning. On the streets of Brooklyn, where crime and opportunity were often 2 sides of the same coin, Al Capone's journey through his early years was marked by contrasts. At home, he was part of a close-knit, hard-working family that valued tradition and discipline. In school, he showed flashes of brilliance, earning high marks and impressing his teachers with his sharp mind. His mother, Teresa in particular, took great pride in her son's achievements, dreaming of a future where he would rise above the hardships that defined immigrant life in Brooklyn. But Al wasn't just a studious child. Beneath the surface of his academic promise was a rebellious streak, a defiance that clashed with the rigid structure of his Catholic school. Rules didn't sit well with young Al, and his temper often got the better of him. It was as if the bustling, rough streets of Brooklyn had imprinted themselves on him, giving him a fiery edge that was difficult to suppress. This tension came to a breaking point when Al was just 14 years old. During an argument, he struck a teacher, a moment of impulsive rage that would alter the course of his life forever. The consequences were swift and severe. He was expelled, abruptly ending his formal education. For most boys his age, this might have been a devastating setback. But for Al Capone, it was a doorway to a new kind of education, one taught not in classrooms, but in the back alleys and shadowy corners of Brooklyn. He quickly found himself drawn to the streets, where power wasn't measured by grades, but by toughness, loyalty, and cunning. Brooklyn at the time was a hotbed of small-time gangs, and young Al found himself in their orbit almost naturally. The allure of quick money, respect, and camaraderie was irresistible. He began running with groups like the Bowery Boys and the Junior 40 Thieves, petty gangs that offered an introduction to the codes and hierarchies of street life. It wasn't long before Al's reputation caught the attention of more established figures in the underworld. His knack for handling himself in tough situations, combined with his sharp mind, made him stand out. By the time he was a teenager, Al Capone was already on a path that would take him far beyond the streets of Brooklyn, though not in the way his parents had ever imagined. The streets of Brooklyn in the early 1900s were a rough-and-tumble world, and for a young Al Capone, They became his new classroom after his abrupt departure from school. Brooklyn wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a crucible where the immigrant experience forged resilience, grit, and often a willingness to bend the rules to get ahead. For boys like Al, it was easy to find role models among the local gangs, who seemed to command a kind of respect and power that was otherwise unattainable in their world. Al's first steps into this underworld were cautious. He began running with small-time gangs like the Bowery Boys and the Junior 40 Thieves. These groups were little more than street-level troublemakers, engaging in petty theft, minor brawls, and the kind of low-stakes schemes that were common in their crowded working-class neighborhoods. For Al, it wasn't just about the money, it was the sense of belonging, the thrill of the hustle, and the lessons he was absorbing about loyalty, respect, and control. It wasn't long before his ambition pushed him toward bigger opportunities. By his teenage years, Al had joined the Brooklyn Rippers, a gang with a more serious reputation, and eventually, the 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York City. The 5 Points Gang was more than a step up. It was a leap into a world of organized crime. Based in Lower Manhattan, this gang was run by seasoned criminals who operated with precision, mixing violence with calculated strategy to maintain control over their territories. It was during this time that Al crossed paths with Frankie Yale, a rising star in the criminal underworld. Yale wasn't just another gangster. He was a businessman of crime, running operations that ranged from extortion to bootlegging. He saw potential in young Capone, who was already displaying the charisma and street smarts that would later define his career. Under Yale's wing, Al started working as a bartender and bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a bar on Coney Island that doubled as a hub for illicit activity. The Harvard Inn was more than just a workplace. It was Al's crash course in the realities of organized crime. He wasn't just mixing drinks or tossing out unruly patrons. He was soaking up the knowledge of how the underworld operated. Yale, ever the mentor, taught him the importance of intimidation, the value of alliances, and the need to keep up appearances. Al learned quickly that success in this world required more than brute force. It demanded strategy, loyalty, and a deep understanding of human nature. It was also at the Harvard Inn where Al earned a nickname he despised, Scarface. A drunken altercation with Frankie Galluccio, a local gangster, ended with Al being slashed across the face, leaving a scar that would become one of his most recognizable features. Though he would later claim it was a war wound, the truth of that night was a reminder of the dangers and unpredictability of the life he was choosing. Despite the scar, Al's confidence only grew. Frankie Yale's mentorship had given him not just skills, but a vision of what was possible. He began to see himself not just as a hustler or a tough guy, but as someone who could rise to the top of this shadowy empire. By the time Al Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago, he was no longer a boy learning the ropes. He was a young man ready to carve out his own legacy in the criminal world. Al Capone's path through the world of crime was marked by pivotal moments, but few were as personal or as public as the one that earned him the nickname Scarface. It happened at the Harvard Inn, the bar on Coney Island where Capone worked under Frankie Yale. At the time, the Harvard Inn was a lively, chaotic mix of business and pleasure, a hub for bootleggers, gamblers, and gangsters. It was the kind of place where tensions simmered just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. One evening, as Capone went about his duties as a bouncer and bartender, he made the kind of misstep that could cost a man dearly in the world of organized crime. Spotting a beautiful young woman at the bar, he decided to compliment her, but his words, intended as flattery, landed poorly. Perhaps it was his tone or the choice of words, but the woman's brother, Frankie Galluccio, took immediate offense. Galluccio, a local gangster with his own reputation to uphold, confronted Capone. What started as a tense exchange quickly escalated. Capone's natural bravado and quick temper clashed with Galluccio's sense of family honor. In the heat of the moment, Galluccio pulled a knife, slashing Capone across the face in a swift, brutal motion. The attack left a deep and lasting scar on the left side of Capone's face, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. The physical wound healed, but the emotional impact lingered. In a world where image and reputation mattered as much as muscle, Capone hated the scar and what it represented. A moment of vulnerability, a chink in his armor. Whenever he could, he posed for photographs with his unscarred side facing the camera. To protect his pride, he spun a tale that he had received the injury during heroic combat in World War I, despite the fact that he had never served in the military. To his closest friends, however, he remained Smokey, a nickname earned for his sharp style and charm. But to the wider world, especially his enemies, Scarface stuck, and Capone despised it. The nickname served as a constant reminder of a youthful mistake and the ever-present dangers of life in the criminal underworld. Interestingly, the story didn't end in bitterness. Capone's mentors, including Frankie Yale, stepped in to mediate the situation, recognizing the importance of keeping peace among allies. Galluccio apologized for the attack, and Capone, showing a rare moment of self-awareness, accepted the apology. He acknowledged that his comment had been inappropriate and respected Galluccio's defense of his family. It was a lesson in the codes of conduct that governed gangland life, codes of honor and respect that Capone would later demand from his own men. Despite the peace, the scar served as a symbol of Capone's rise. It was an indelible mark of his time in Brooklyn, a chapter of his life that was about to give way to something much larger. Soon, Capone would leave the streets of New York behind, taking the lessons, scars, and ambitions of his youth to the city where he would make his infamous name, Chicago. In December 1918, Al Capone, still a young man of just 19, made a life-changing decision that would anchor him in the tumultuous years to come. He married May Josephine Coughlin, a kind-hearted Irish Catholic woman 2 years his senior. Their union was hastened by the birth of their son, Albert Francis Capone, affectionately known as Sonny, born just weeks earlier. Despite the whirlwind circumstances, this marriage would prove to be a constant in Al's unpredictable life. May was everything Al wasn't, a calm, stabilizing presence in stark contrast to his fiery, larger-than-life persona. She worked in a department store before meeting Al and had a quiet dignity that earned her the admiration of those around her. Theirs was a love that might have seemed unlikely, but the bond between them was strong. When Al proposed marriage, his youth meant he needed written consent from his parents. Gabriel and Teresa, ever traditional and family-focused, gave their blessing, and the young couple began their life together. From the outset, May was more than just Al's wife. She was his partner in life and, in many ways, his sanctuary. While Al's world was filled with the chaos of the criminal underworld, May focused on creating a stable home for their son. She maintained an unwavering loyalty to her husband, even as his infamy grew and his name became synonymous with crime. The birth of Sonny brought a new dimension to Al's life. While he ruled the streets with an iron fist, at home he was reportedly a doting father, lavishing his son with attention and gifts. Sonny, who suffered from congenital hearing loss, became a symbol of family pride and vulnerability. Al's devotion to his son was one of the few facets of his life that showed a softer side to the man known for his ruthlessness. May's steadfast presence provided a foundation for their family, even as Al's life spiraled deeper into crime and notoriety. She kept their private life shielded as much as possible from the glare of public attention. Despite the mounting pressures of Al's criminal lifestyle, their marriage remained intact, a testament to May's quiet strength and Al's regard for her. As Al's wealth grew from his criminal enterprises, he ensured May and Sonny were provided with every comfort. Their family home in Chicago, and later their estate in Palm Island, Florida, reflected the opulence that marked Al's public image. Yet for May, it wasn't about the riches or the notoriety. She valued the sanctity of their family above all else, and this quiet resilience held their union together through years of turbulence. Through scandals, arrests, and Al's eventual imprisonment, May remained by his side. She visited him regularly during his incarceration, becoming his primary connection to the outside world. Even as Al's health declined due to untreated syphilis, May's loyalty never wavered. In his final years, it was May who cared for him, ensuring he lived out his days surrounded by family. Theirs was a relationship that defied the odds, a love story woven into the larger narrative of Al Capone's rise and fall. May's enduring strength and devotion to her family served as a poignant counterbalance to the violence and chaos that surrounded Al's public life. Together, they built a family that, against all odds, remained intact, a quiet testament to the resilience of love in the face of adversity. In 1919, Al Capone left the bustling streets of Brooklyn behind, trading the familiar neighborhoods of his youth for a fresh start in the vibrant, chaotic city of Chicago. The move wasn't just about escaping the small-time criminal operations of New York. It was about opportunity. Al's mentor, Johnny Torrio, a powerful and strategic figure in organized crime, had summoned him to join his operations in the Windy City. For Al, it was an offer too big to refuse. Torrio was no ordinary gangster. He was a visionary, someone who saw the potential to turn crime into an empire. Chicago, with its sprawling neighborhoods and entrenched corruption, offered fertile ground for Torrio's ambitions. Prohibition had just taken hold, and with it came an insatiable demand for alcohol. Torrio recognized that bootlegging could be more than just a hustle. It could be a fortune. He needed someone with Al's street smarts and charisma to help expand his operations. When Al arrived in Chicago, the city was alive with opportunity, but also rife with danger. Torrio placed him in charge of managing several saloons and brothels, offering a crash course in the workings of Chicago's underworld. It was here, amidst the smoke-filled rooms and shadowy deals, that Al began to understand the scale of what was possible. This wasn't Brooklyn anymore. The stakes were higher, the players more ruthless, and the rewards beyond anything he had imagined. But Chicago also had its costs. During his early days in the city, Al contracted syphilis, likely while working in or managing one of Torrio's brothels. At the time, syphilis was a common but devastating disease, and treatments were still in their infancy. Al, like many men of his era, ignored the early symptoms. What could have been cured with the new drug Salvarsan went untreated, a decision that would haunt him in the years to come as the disease slowly eroded his health. Despite this setback, Al flourished under Torrio's guidance. Torrio was more than a boss. He was a mentor, teaching Al the art of diplomacy and the importance of alliances. Unlike many gangsters who relied solely on brute force, Torrio believed in building networks, using influence and bribes to keep law enforcement and politicians on his side. Al absorbed these lessons eagerly, adding them to the lessons he had learned in Brooklyn's back alleys. Chicago was a city in flux, its criminal landscape divided among rival factions vying for control. Torrio, with Al at his side, sought to unite these groups under his leadership. It was an ambitious goal, but it required navigating a delicate balance of power. Al's role grew quickly. His sharp instincts and natural charisma made him a valuable asset, and his loyalty to Torrio never wavered. This move to Chicago wasn't just a change of scenery for Al Capone. It was the beginning of his transformation. Under Torrio's wing, he went from a street-smart hustler to a key figure in one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in the country. The lessons he learned during these early years would serve as the foundation for his rise to power, shaping the man who would soon become one of the most infamous figures in American history. When Prohibition took effect in 1920, it transformed the American landscape, not just socially, but economically. The 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages, aimed to curb societal ills. Instead, it created an unprecedented demand for illegal liquor, a demand that Al Capone and his associates were ready to exploit. Capone, under the guidance of Johnny Torrio, quickly recognized the enormous profit potential in bootlegging. Alcohol didn't just vanish with Prohibition. It went underground, creating a black market that turned ordinary speakeasies into gold mines. For Torrio and Capone, this wasn't just a business opportunity. It was the foundation of an empire. At the heart of their operation were the breweries and distilleries scattered across Chicago. These hidden facilities produced a steady stream of illegal alcohol, which was then distributed through a sophisticated network of drivers, middlemen, and saloon owners. Capone and Torrio didn't just supply the product, they controlled the entire pipeline, ensuring maximum profits while cutting out competitors. But alcohol was just one piece of the puzzle. Capone understood that the key to maintaining power was diversification. Brothels, speakeasies, and gambling dens became central to his operations, creating a web of vice that catered to every illicit craving in Chicago. Each establishment not only brought in revenue but also extended his influence, turning entire neighborhoods into his personal fiefdoms. Capone's ability to manage these ventures was unmatched. He combined Torrio's knack for organization with his own charisma and street smarts. While Torrio preferred to operate behind the scenes, Capone thrived in the spotlight. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a larger-than-life figure who reveled in his notoriety. People were drawn to his confidence, his flair, and the mystique of his growing empire. As the operation expanded, so did the need for protection. Rival gangs, law enforcement, and reformist politicians all posed threats to the enterprise. Capone's solution was a mixture of violence and bribery. For those who couldn't be bought, he unleashed a wave of intimidation that kept competitors and would-be reformers in check. Bombings and shootings became common, and Capone's men enforced his will with ruthless efficiency. Despite the bloodshed, Capone cultivated an image of himself as a man of the people. He was careful to funnel some of his wealth back into the community, funding soup kitchens and making charitable donations during the Great Depression. To the average Chicagoan, he was a modern-day Robin Hood, giving the public what they wanted while thumbing his nose at authority. By the mid-1920s, Capone's organization had grown into a criminal juggernaut. His reach extended far beyond Chicago, with his bootlegging network spanning state lines and even reaching Canada. Prohibition had turned the city into a battleground, but for Capone, it was also a proving ground, a place where he honed his skills, built his empire, and solidified his reputation as one of the most powerful and feared men in the country. The rise of organized crime during this era wasn't just a product of greed or ambition. It was a response to the laws that created an opening for men like Capone. He didn't invent crime, but he mastered it, seizing every opportunity and turning vice into an industry. The Prohibition era may have been America's experiment in morality, but for Capone, it was the ultimate business opportunity, a chance to build an empire in the shadows of the law. By the early 1920s, Al Capone and Johnny Torrio's criminal enterprise in Chicago had grown to extraordinary heights. However, with success came scrutiny. Reformist politicians, led by figures like Chicago Mayor William Emmett Deaver, began cracking down on corruption and organized crime in the city. For Torrio and Capone, this increased attention posed a serious threat to their operations. They needed a new stronghold, one that offered the freedom to operate without interference from reformist law enforcement. The answer was Cicero, a nearby suburb ripe for the taking. Cicero was a quiet town compared to Chicago, but it had its advantages. It was just far enough from the city to avoid the direct oversight of reformist politicians, yet close enough to serve as a hub for their bootlegging empire. Crucially, Cicero's local government and police force were far more susceptible to bribery and intimidation, making it an ideal refuge for Capone's growing network of illegal breweries, brothels, and gambling dens. Once the decision was made, Capone and Torrio moved swiftly. Their first order of business was establishing control over Cicero's local government. In 1924, during the municipal elections, Capone orchestrated a campaign of violence and intimidation designed to ensure victory for their chosen candidates. It was a brazen display of power and a chilling example of how far Capone was willing to go to secure his operations. On the eve of the election, Capone's men unleashed chaos across the town. Campaign offices of opposing candidates were ransacked, workers were beaten, and anyone who dared resist was met with brute force. On election day, armed gangsters patrolled polling stations, threatening voters and ensuring ballots were cast for their candidates. Some voters were forced to cast multiple votes, while others were kept away from the polls entirely. The violence wasn't limited to intimidation. Several prominent Democratic candidates and their supporters were physically attacked. One candidate's campaign headquarters was sprayed with gunfire, while another was pistol-whipped in front of his family. Even local police officers were not spared. Capone's men disarmed and beat a police officer who attempted to intervene. The most dramatic moment of the election came when Capone's brother, Frank Capone, confronted police in a heated standoff. A gunfight erupted, and Frank was shot and killed by law enforcement. Al Capone, devastated by the loss of his brother, spared no expense on Frank's funeral, ensuring it was a lavish display of loyalty and grief. But his resolve to control Cicero only hardened. Despite the violence and chaos, Capone's efforts were successful. Their chosen candidates won the election, and Cicero effectively fell under Capone's control. With the local government in their pocket, the town became a haven for their criminal operations. Illegal breweries flourished, speakeasies operated openly, and anyone who opposed their rule was dealt with swiftly and ruthlessly. The Cicero takeover was a turning point for Al Capone. It demonstrated his ability to combine brute force with strategic thinking, solidifying his reputation as a powerful and dangerous figure. It also marked the beginning of his full emergence as the face of organized crime in the Chicago area. Cicero wasn't just a retreat. It was a launching pad for the next phase of his empire. While Capone's control over Cicero insulated him from reformist politicians in Chicago, it also painted a target on his back. Rival gangs, law enforcement, and reformers watched his every move, waiting for their chance to bring him down. But for now, Capone was untouchable, his grip on Cicero as firm as the iron fist with which he ruled. As Al Capone's empire expanded, so too did the tensions with rival gangs. The most bitter of these rivalries was with the North Side Gang, a powerful organization led first by Jaime Weiss and later by Bugs Moran. This conflict wasn't just about territory. It was a battle for dominance over Chicago's lucrative bootlegging trade, where alliances were fragile, betrayals frequent, and violence inevitable. The North Side Gang operated out of the bustling neighborhoods north of downtown Chicago, with roots deeply embedded in the local community. Initially led by the charismatic Dean O'Banion, the gang had established itself as a formidable force. However, O'Banion's murder in 1924, allegedly orchestrated by Johnny Torrio and carried out by Capone's associates, ignited a firestorm of vengeance that would last for years. Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's successor, took the helm, driven by a single goal: to destroy Capone and his South Side outfit. Weiss was a bold and relentless adversary, earning the nickname the Polish Terror for his fearless approach. He and his men waged a relentless campaign against Capone, targeting his operations with bombings, drive-by shootings, and assassinations. For Capone, who thrived on control, Weiss represented chaos, a thorn in his side that he couldn't easily remove. One of the most infamous incidents of this violent rivalry came in September 1926, when Capone was nearly killed in an ambush at his headquarters, the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero. The North Side Gang launched a daring attack, pulling up in a fleet of cars armed with Thompson submachine guns. In a coordinated assault, they unleashed a barrage of over 1,000 bullets into the building, riddling the walls with gunfire. Inside, Capone was dining with associates when the attack began. He dove for cover as bullets tore through the windows and doors. Miraculously, he and his men escaped unharmed, but the message was clear. His enemies wouldn't stop until he was dead. Capone reportedly emerged from the attack shaken but defiant, declaring that he would settle the score with the North Side Gang. Despite the mounting violence, Capone attempted to broker peace. He called for a truce, hoping to stabilize the underworld and avoid further bloodshed. Negotiations were held, but the deep-seated animosity between the two factions made compromise impossible. The rivalry continued to escalate, becoming one of the bloodiest periods in Chicago's criminal history. When Jaime Weiss was gunned down outside the North Side Gang's headquarters in 1926, leadership passed to George Bugs Moran, another fierce opponent of Capone. Moran was as determined as Weiss, and his disdain for Capone went beyond business. A devout Catholic, Moran despised Capone's involvement in prostitution and saw him as morally corrupt. The conflict took on a personal dimension, with both men vowing to eliminate the other. The rivalry with the North Side Gang became a defining chapter in Capone's rise to power. It showcased the lengths he was willing to go to protect his empire, but it also revealed the dangers of the life he had chosen. Each attack and counterattack brought him closer to both total domination and total destruction. For Capone, the stakes were nothing less than survival, and the battles he fought during these years would leave a bloody legacy that shaped his reputation as one of the most notorious gangsters in American history. The morning of February 14, 1929, began quietly enough in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. But by midday, it would be remembered as one of the most infamous events in American criminal history: the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The shocking display of violence not only marked a turning point in the city's brutal gang wars, but also forever solidified Al Capone's reputation as the ruthless face of organized crime. For years, the rivalry between Capone and George "Bugs" Moran, the leader of the North Side Gang, had been escalating. Moran's defiance of Capone's dominance in the bootlegging business and his relentless attacks on Capone's men made him a thorn that couldn't be ignored. To Capone, Moran was not just competition, he was an insult to his power. Something had to be done to remove him once and for all. Capone devised a plan as calculated as it was brutal. The operation was a ruse designed to lure Moran and his top men to a specific location. Capone's associates, posing as suppliers, promised Moran a shipment of high-quality whiskey at an unbeatable price. The delivery was to take place at 10:30 a.m. at the SMC Cartage Company warehouse on North Clark Street, where Moran's men often gathered. Unbeknownst to Moran, Capone's real plan was already in motion. On the morning of the deal, 4 of Capone's men arrived at the warehouse, 2 dressed in police uniforms and 2 in civilian clothes. The fake police officers staged what appeared to be a routine raid, instructing the 7 men inside to line up against the wall, seemingly for a search. The North Side Gang members complied, believing it to be just another run-in with the law. But there was no search. Instead, Capone's men opened fire with Thompson submachine guns and shotguns, methodically mowing down their targets in a hail of bullets. The massacre was over in moments, leaving 6 gang members and 1 associate dead in a blood-soaked scene. The killers then made their getaway, with the fake police uniforms providing just enough confusion to delay any immediate response. The intended target, Bugs Moran, was not among the dead. A stroke of luck had caused him to arrive late to the warehouse that morning, sparing his life. Upon hearing the news, Moran was quick to blame Capone, calling him a coward who resorted to slaughter rather than face his enemies directly. While Capone denied any involvement, the public and law enforcement had little doubt about who had orchestrated the massacre. The aftermath was seismic. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre shocked the nation, its gruesome photographs splashed across newspapers coast to coast. It painted a vivid and horrifying picture of the unchecked violence that had come to define Prohibition-era Chicago. For many, it was the moment when the glamour of the gangster lifestyle was stripped away, replaced by the stark reality of bloodshed and brutality. For Capone, the massacre was both a victory and a curse. While it effectively decimated Moran's power and tightened Capone's grip on Chicago's underworld, the fallout was immense. Public opinion turned sharply against him. Once seen by some as a modern-day Robin Hood who provided for the city's downtrodden, Capone was now branded a cold-blooded killer. The media gave him a new title, Public Enemy Number 1. The massacre also caught the attention of federal authorities, who had been struggling to bring Capone to justice. While local law enforcement was often too corrupt or intimidated to act, the federal government now had the public mandate to take Capone down. The massacre, in many ways, marked the beginning of the end for Al Capone. Though he remained defiant, insisting he had nothing to do with the killings, Capone could not escape the shadow of the massacre. It became a defining moment in his legacy, one that would forever link his name to the darkest chapters of American crime history. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre wasn't just an act of violence, it was a declaration of Capone's power, and the price of challenging it. Al Capone's life was a study in contrasts. On one hand, he was a ruthless mob boss whose empire was built on bootlegging, gambling, and violence. On the other, he cultivated an image of a man of the people, a charismatic figure who enjoyed the finer things in life while sharing his wealth with the less fortunate. It was a carefully constructed persona, equal parts reality and myth, that contributed to his mystique as one of America's most infamous figures. Capone's taste for extravagance was evident in everything he did. He dressed in tailored suits made from the finest fabrics, each one costing a small fortune. His accessories, a diamond-encrusted pinky ring, custom-made shoes, and silk ties, spoke of wealth and power. Wherever he went, a cigar was often perched between his fingers, a signature accessory that became synonymous with his larger-than-life persona. Even his nickname among close friends, Big Al, reflected the outsized way he carried himself. But Capone's flair wasn't limited to his wardrobe. He was a connoisseur of luxury, from gourmet cuisine to the most exclusive champagne. He hosted lavish parties at his homes in Chicago and Florida, where politicians, entertainers, and even law enforcement officials mingled with gangsters. These events weren't just social gatherings. They were showcases of Capone's influence and wealth, carefully designed to reinforce his power. Despite his opulent lifestyle, Capone was careful to cultivate the image of a man connected to the common people. During the Great Depression, when many Americans were struggling to put food on the table, Capone opened soup kitchens in Chicago, feeding thousands of hungry residents each day. It was a strategic move, one that bolstered his public image and won him the admiration of many who saw him as a modern Robin Hood, a man who took from the system and gave back to the people. Yet this charitable facade masked the true source of his wealth. Every tailored suit, every diamond ring, and every charitable gesture was funded by the proceeds of organized crime. Capone's empire was built on the back of illegal liquor, gambling rackets, and extortion schemes that exploited Chicago's working-class neighborhoods. For every dollar he gave away, there were countless more earned through violence, intimidation, and corruption. Capone was a master of optics, using his wealth not just to indulge himself but to solidify his reputation. He knew the power of public perception, and he played the part of a benefactor to perfection. Whether it was donating to local causes or paying hospital bills for injured policemen, his acts of generosity often served dual purposes, silencing critics and reinforcing his influence. However, as much as Capone sought to portray himself as a benevolent figure, the darker side of his empire could never be entirely hidden. The violence and corruption that fueled his wealth cast a long shadow over his public image. While some admired his audacity and flair, others saw him for what he truly was, a criminal mastermind who profited from the suffering of others. By the late 1920s, Capone's lavish lifestyle had become a symbol of excess, drawing both admiration and scrutiny. His willingness to flaunt his wealth made him a celebrity, but it also made him a target. Federal authorities, unable to prosecute him for his more violent crimes, began to focus on his finances, knowing that his high-profile indulgences would eventually lead to his downfall. Capone's luxurious way of life was both his greatest strength and his Achilles heel. It reinforced his power and mystique, but it also underscored the stark realities of how that power was achieved. In the end, his extravagance became a testament to the contradictions of his life, a man who lived large, gave generously, and yet left a legacy steeped in blood and betrayal. By the late 1920s, Al Capone's reign over Chicago's underworld was as solid as ever, but the walls were beginning to close in. His empire had grown too large, his reputation too infamous to avoid scrutiny forever. Federal authorities, frustrated by their inability to link him directly to violent crimes, began looking for other ways to bring him down. It was the beginning of a legal chess game that would ultimately spell the end of Capone's dominance. Capone's first serious run-ins with the law came in the form of arrests for relatively minor offenses. In 1929, he was caught carrying a concealed weapon in Philadelphia, an incident that landed him a short prison sentence. It was an unusual misstep for Capone, who was typically careful about keeping a low profile when it came to law enforcement. However, even behind bars, his influence was undeniable. Capone managed to live in relative comfort, his prison stay a minor inconvenience rather than a significant punishment. This wasn't his first brush with the law. Earlier, he had faced a charge of contempt of court for feigning illness to avoid testifying in a case. Capone had claimed he was too sick to appear in court, only for investigators to discover that he had been living comfortably in Florida at the time. It was a bold, audacious move, one that exemplified his belief that the law could be bent to his will. And for a time it was. Bribes and intimidation ensured that most cases against him fell apart before they reached a courtroom. But the tide began to turn when federal authorities devised a groundbreaking strategy to target Capone. If they couldn't convict him for murder or bootlegging, they would go after his finances. Enter the novel approach of prosecuting Capone for tax evasion. It was a tactic born of necessity and creativity, spearheaded by Treasury officials who realized that even illegally earned income was taxable under U.S. law. Capone, like many gangsters of his time, had never bothered to file income tax returns. To him, it seemed unnecessary. His wealth came from the shadows, far from the prying eyes of the IRS. But this oversight proved to be a critical vulnerability. Investigators began piecing together a financial trail, using everything from witness testimony to evidence of Capone's lavish spending to estimate his taxable income. The breakthrough came when Capone's own lawyers, in an attempt to clean up his financial records, declared his income for 1928 and 1929 as $100,000 per year. It was an effort to stave off further investigation, but it backfired spectacularly. By admitting that Capone had earned significant income during those years, his legal team had also admitted that he had failed to pay taxes on it. In essence, they had handed federal prosecutors the evidence they needed to build their case. This marked the beginning of Capone's legal unraveling. Prosecutors wasted no time pursuing charges, indicting him for tax evasion, and effectively turning his own wealth into a weapon against him. The case wasn't just about Capone. It was a statement to other gangsters that no one, not even the most powerful crime boss in America, was above the law. As the legal battles began to heat up, Capone tried every trick in the book to avoid prosecution. He delayed court dates by claiming illness, made overtures for plea deals, and continued to rely on bribes and intimidation. But this time, the government was determined to see the case through. The charges stuck, and for the first time in his career, Capone faced the very real possibility of losing everything. The tax evasion strategy was revolutionary in its simplicity, but it worked. By focusing on the undeniable, Capone's wealth and failure to pay taxes, prosecutors avoided the pitfalls of proving violent crimes that relied on reluctant witnesses and circumstantial evidence. It was a strategy that would later become a cornerstone of law enforcement efforts against organized crime. But in 1931, it was a gamble. For Capone, the irony was bitter. The man who had evaded justice for years, who had bribed officials and outmaneuvered rivals with ease, was finally being undone by something as mundane as taxes. And yet, for all his power and cunning, there was no escaping the reality that the government had finally found his Achilles heel. By the late 1920s, Al Capone's empire had grown so vast that it seemed untouchable. His control over Chicago's underworld was absolute, with politicians, law enforcement, and rival gangs either in his pocket or crushed under his boot. Yet, as Capone reveled in his success, a new force was quietly rising to challenge him, a team of relentless federal agents led by a young Prohibition officer named Elliot Ness. Ness was just 26 years old when he was tasked with bringing down Capone. Unlike many law enforcement officials of the time, Ness and his hand-picked team of agents were incorruptible, earning them the nickname the Untouchables. While Capone relied on bribery and intimidation to keep local police and politicians under control, he found no such leverage against Ness and his men. The Untouchables focused on dismantling Capone's bootlegging operations, the backbone of his criminal empire. Armed with wiretaps, surveillance, and a dogged determination, Ness and his team raided breweries and distilleries, smashing Capone's supply chains and confiscating millions of dollars worth of illegal liquor. Each raid struck a blow to Capone's finances, forcing him to scramble to maintain control over his vast operation. While Ness and the Untouchables were relentless in their pursuit, they knew that bootlegging alone wouldn't be enough to put Capone behind bars. That task fell to federal prosecutors, who had been quietly building a case against Capone for tax evasion. It was an unglamorous approach to taking down a man whose crimes included murder and extortion, but it was a strategy that proved devastatingly effective. In 1931, Al Capone was finally brought to trial. The charges weren't for murder, racketeering, or bootlegging, but for failing to pay taxes on his enormous illegal income. The trial was a media spectacle, with Capone's larger-than-life persona drawing crowds and headlines. Yet behind the scenes, Capone's legal team was scrambling. They had expected a plea bargain to result in a relatively light sentence, but the judge presiding over the case refused to honor any such deal. The full weight of the law was about to fall on Capone. The evidence against him was straightforward yet damning. Federal prosecutors presented detailed records of Capone's extravagant lifestyle, juxtaposed against his complete lack of filed tax returns. Witnesses testified about his income, and even Capone's own lawyers had inadvertently admitted his guilt by previously declaring his taxable income for 1928 and 1929. Despite his attempts to charm the courtroom, Capone's defense was weak. His lawyers argued that his wealth came from gambling winnings and that any unreported income was due to poor bookkeeping rather than intentional evasion. The jury, however, was not convinced. After deliberating, they returned with a verdict. Capone was guilty on multiple counts of tax evasion. On October 24, 1931, Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay $215,000 in back taxes and interest. It was the harshest sentence ever given for tax evasion at the time, a clear message from the federal government that no one, not even a crime boss as powerful as Capone, was above the law. The conviction marked the end of an era. For years, Capone had ruled Chicago with an iron fist, his name synonymous with wealth, power, and violence. Now, he was reduced to a prisoner, his empire crumbling in his absence. The efforts of Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, combined with the groundbreaking use of tax evasion laws, had achieved what many thought was impossible. They had brought down Al Capone. Though Capone continued to wield some influence from behind bars, his conviction signaled the decline of his power. His downfall was as dramatic as his rise, a cautionary tale of how even the most untouchable figures can ultimately be undone. After his conviction in 1931, Al Capone's life as a free man came to an abrupt end. Sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, he began serving his time at the Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary in 1932. But even behind bars, Capone's notoriety followed him. He maintained a semblance of power, reportedly enjoying privileges and protection thanks to bribes and his enduring influence. However, this uneasy existence was short-lived. In 1934, Capone was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, a move designed to strip him of his connections and cut him off from the outside world. Alcatraz, situated on a desolate island in San Francisco Bay, was unlike any prison Capone had experienced. Its harsh conditions and strict discipline were meant to break even the most hardened criminals. Here, Capone was no longer the untouchable mob boss. He was just another inmate, stripped of his wealth, power, and carefully crafted persona. Life at Alcatraz was grueling. Capone's health, already compromised by years of untreated syphilis, began to deteriorate rapidly. He was often disoriented and struggled to keep up with the demands of the prison routine. His condition worsened to the point where he became an easy target for other inmates, many of whom resented his celebrity status. In one particularly harrowing incident, Capone was attacked in the prison laundry by a fellow inmate, James "Tex" Lucas, who stabbed him with a pair of scissors. Though Capone survived the attack with only minor injuries, it underscored his vulnerability and the harsh realities of life in Alcatraz. By 1938, the effects of syphilis had become unmistakable. The disease, which had gone untreated for years, began to ravage his brain, leading to severe mental deterioration. Once a sharp and calculating figure, Capone was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. His mental state reportedly regressed to that of a child, and he spent much of his time in a daze, unable to comprehend the world around him. In his final year at Alcatraz, Capone was confined to the prison hospital, where he received little more than palliative care. Recognizing the futility of keeping a man in such poor health incarcerated, the federal government granted Capone parole in 1939. He was released from prison and immediately transferred to a hospital in Baltimore, where he was treated for paresis, a severe neurological condition caused by advanced syphilis. Although a newly developed drug, penicillin, was administered, it came too late to reverse the damage. The once feared mob boss now required constant care, his mind and body irreparably broken. After his release from the hospital, Capone retreated to his estate on Palm Island in Florida. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of his wealth and power, now became a quiet refuge where he lived out his remaining days. Family members, particularly his loyal wife May, shielded him from the public eye, ensuring that his decline remained as private as possible. For Capone, the years following his release were marked by a slow, inevitable decline. The disease that had plagued him for decades continued to take its toll, robbing him of his faculties and reducing the legendary gangster to a man barely capable of recognizing those around him. By the mid-1940s, his mental state had deteriorated so severely that doctors estimated his cognitive abilities were equivalent to those of a 12-year-old. The mighty Al Capone, who had once commanded an empire of crime and defied the law at every turn, spent his final years in obscurity. His decline was a stark contrast to the life he had led, a humbling end for a man who had once seemed larger than life. In January 1947, after suffering a stroke and contracting pneumonia, Capone passed away at the age of 48. He died surrounded by family, far from the spotlight that had defined much of his existence. Capone's imprisonment and subsequent decline were more than just the end of a criminal empire. They were a reminder of the fragility of even the most powerful figures. For all his wealth, influence, and notoriety, Capone could not escape the consequences of his actions or the relentless march of time. After his release from prison in November 1939, Al Capone retreated to the one place that still felt like home, his luxurious estate on Palm Island, Florida. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of his immense power and wealth, now served as a quiet refuge for a man whose physical and mental faculties were rapidly declining. Capone's wife, May, remained by his side, shielding him from the outside world and ensuring he received care during his final years. By this time, Capone's condition was dire. Years of untreated syphilis had caused irreparable damage to his brain, leaving him confused, disoriented, and often childlike in behavior. Doctors treated him with penicillin, a groundbreaking drug that had only recently been developed, but it was too late to reverse the progression of his disease. While the treatment may have slowed the infection's advance, the damage to Capone's mind and body was permanent. At Palm Island, Capone lived a life far removed from his days as the king of Chicago's underworld. His once sharp mind, which had orchestrated an empire of crime, was now clouded by the effects of neurosyphilis. Family members reported that his mental capacity had regressed to that of a child. He spent his days fishing in the estate's pond, sitting quietly on the grounds, or listening to old records, simple pleasures that stood in stark contrast to the violent, high-octane life he had once led. In January 1947, Capone's health took a final turn for the worse. He suffered a stroke on January 21st, leaving him bedridden and unresponsive. As his body struggled to recover, he developed bronchopneumonia, a complication that further weakened him. On January 25th, Capone's heart gave out and he passed away at the age of 48. In his final moments, he was surrounded by his family, the people who had remained loyal to him even as his empire crumbled and his health deteriorated. Capone's death marked the end of an era. His funeral, though private, drew significant attention from the media and the public. Initially buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, his remains were later moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where he was interred alongside his father and brother. Even in death, Al Capone remained a figure of fascination and infamy. Legacy: Al Capone's life left an indelible mark on American history. He became the quintessential symbol of the gangster era, a figure whose name conjures images of Prohibition-era speakeasies, machine gun battles, and extravagant wealth. His ability to navigate the intersections of crime, politics, and public opinion made him a uniquely powerful figure in his time. For some, Capone was a Robin Hood-like character who defied authority and provided for the downtrodden. Stories of his charitable acts, like opening soup kitchens during the Great Depression, added to this mystique. For others, he was a ruthless criminal who rose to power through violence, corruption, and exploitation. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, among other atrocities, ensured his legacy would always be stained with blood. Capone's downfall, orchestrated not through evidence of his violent crimes but through the quiet precision of tax laws, is a testament to the complexities of his life. It highlighted the government's struggle to combat organized crime during a time when corruption and public demand for illegal goods often outpaced the law. Even today, Capone remains an iconic figure in popular culture. He has been immortalized in films, books, and television as the archetype of the American gangster, a man who wielded immense power but was ultimately undone by his own excesses and the relentless march of justice. Al Capone's story is a cautionary tale, a blend of myth and reality that continues to captivate audiences. It is a story of ambition and excess, of power and vulnerability, and of the thin line between legend and infamy. Through it all, Capone's life serves as a mirror reflecting the complex interplay of crime, power, and public perception in America's past. And that brings us to the end of Al Capone's extraordinary, complex, and cautionary tale. From his meteoric rise to his dramatic fall, Capone's story remains a powerful reminder of the allure and consequences of power, crime, and ambition. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of one of history's most infamous figures, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Bytes for more stories that uncover the lives behind the legends. Let us know in the comments, do you see Capone as a modern-day Robin Hood or a ruthless criminal mastermind? Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more fascinating stories from history's most captivating personalities. See you in the next episode.